This is video 6 in the standard library fixed objects module, and in this video we'll talk about entity batching. In particular, we'll talk about the difference between parent entities and member entities. We'll talk and demonstrate the use of the combiner object from the standard library, and then we'll go over two symbits that incorporate combiner objects into models. In Simio, the concept of batching involves two different entity types. We have member entities that are grouped into a batch, and we have parent entity that actually carries the members in the batch queue. And so by carrying the entities, you can animate the batch queue, and so you can see the entities. You can then split the entity, so you can create a batch, split a batch, create a batch, split a batch, which we'll see. And you can also have parent entities may also be themselves batched, and so you can have a parent entity that carries member entities, and that parent entity is part of another batch. And so you can create a hierarchical structure with an arbitrary number of nesting levels. So this is the view of the combiner object. You can see that we have a parent input buffer, a member input buffer. We have a processing station. We have an output buffer. We have parent input node, member input nodes, an output node, and this is how entities are transferred in and out of the object. So if you just sort of cover up the member input components here, this looks a lot like a server. And in fact, except for the batching logic, the object behaves almost exactly like a server. So think about a parent entity arriving, being transferred into the parent input buffer, transferred into the processing station when there's capacity available, going through some processing, going to an output buffer, and through the output node back onto the network or into free space. And so you have that same general behavior that we saw with the server object. And so all of the add-on processes and reliability logic and things that we discussed with respect to the server are also available with the combiner. And then to that we add this concept of attaching member entities or grouping member entities and then attaching those to the parent entity. So rather than building a sample model from scratch, as we've done in previous videos, this time we're going to look at a couple of symbits that incorporate the use of the combiner. And so at the time that this video was made, there were 4 symbits that demonstrate how to use a combiner or demonstrate the use of a combiner. And so in this video, we're going to look at the first two, the regenerating combiner symbit and the combine multiple entity types onto a palette symbit, which is the image that we see right here is from this second symbit. There are 2 additional symbits that I would highly recommend that you have a look at. We're just not going to do them in this video. So let's switch to Simio and look at our first symbit. Recall what symbits are. First of all, we go to the support ribbon and we see that over here on the left side we have symbit solutions. And so if I click on that, we get a listing of the available symbits. And remember that symbits are specialized models, typically very small models that are used to demonstrate one or a very small number of specific concepts. And so what we're going to do is look at that first one that's regenerating combiner. So I'm going to go to the search button box and just start typing regenerating. Let's see, and there it comes, and so there it comes. And also remember, looking at the help here, if I click on this link, it opens the symbit in another instance of the Simio application. So if I'm working on a model and I don't want to exit my current model, then I can just click on this and it will open a second instance of Simio. On the other hand, if I want to open the model in the current instance of Simio, I can simply hold the Shift key down. And so that's what I'm going to do. It typically opens a little quicker. So let me do that. So I don't want to save my current version. I didn't really have anything in that model. And so it opens the symbit. And one thing that you can't see, let me just drag this over, is that the symbit has a PDF document that describes the problem, the categories, key concepts, and then the model itself. And so we have an assumption, a technical approach of how to solve the problem, and then a complete set of details about how to build the model. So we're not going to look at that in the video. We're just going to actually look at the model and go through how the model works, and in particular how the combiner works for this symbit. So let's run the model and then we can discuss what's going on. And so recall that with a combiner, the notion of batching, you have a parent entity that carries member entities, and in this case our parent entity is the pallet and the member entities are the parts, and the parent entity comes to the parent input, the member entities come to the member input, and they're combined. In this case, as noted here, each pallet gets 7 parts. So if we enlarge that a little bit, let's pause or let's stop the simulation and go back to the combiner. You can see that we specified that each pallet gets 7 parts here in the batch quantity. We have a matching rule, and so a matching rule lets me specify how we choose entities, member entities to attach to the parent. And in this one, we're just doing any arriving entity. So any entity that arrives here will be eligible to be batched. In this case, we only have one type, one entity type, other than the parent entity, that is, and so any entity that's in the input buffer is eligible. As we're going to see in the subsequent, in the next sim bit, that we're going to use a different option here, but we can use different matching members or match member and parents. And so if we do matching members, then it will only batch members that match on a particular attribute or particular expression. If we match members and parent, that lets us specify an expression for the parent and for the members, and it will only batch when all of those things match. There are other batching options here. Let me enlarge this just a little bit. You can see that we can specify ranking rules for both inputs, the parent and for the member. We can also specify whether we simultaneously batch. And remember, when we're looking at properties, if we select the property, we can get a little bit of help here at the bottom. And so this says, do I want to go start the batching process in the case where I don't have sufficient entities to complete the batch, or do I want to wait until all of the entities are available? In this case, that's set to true, so we must all of the member entities have to be there before we start the batching process. The release batch early triggers allows us to set events or times that elapse, under which case the parent would be released from the combiner object without having the required number of member entities for the batch. So we see the ... here, meaning that this is a repeat group. So if I just click on that, you can see that it brings up the repeat group editor, and we'll just take a look at these. So if I add one, as I mentioned, there are 2 types of this release. One is time-based, and so we have a wait duration that we specify, and the second is event-based. So we specify a custom event, and if that event occurs, then the parent will be released even if the required number of member entities aren't there. And finally, we have an option to suspend batching when down. So if we have a failure logic, if we have the combiner goes through a failure process, you can specify whether the batching will continue even though the object itself, or the processing part of the object, is down, using the reliability logic that we saw when we talked about the server. The process logic is what we saw. Oops, let me click back here. The process logic is the same logic that we saw when we did the server. So I'm not going to discuss that in this video. And similarly, the buffer logic is also similar, except now instead of having a single input buffer, we actually have 2. We have one for the parent and one for the members. But the balking and the capacity and so on are treated the same way. We have the reliability logic that I mentioned before, so where you can specify failures, secondary resources, state assignments, table row referencing, exactly what we saw when we covered the server object. And finally, for this sim bit, remember the name of the sim bit is regenerating combiner, and so the regenerating part comes from how we implement the pallet logic. So with our source object, we use an on-event arrival model, and the event is the output at combiner 1 exited. So essentially what we do is we create 3 pallets initially, and then every time a full pallet, exits the output node, we create another pallet entity. So you can see there are 3, one being batched, and then every time one departs, we create another one. And so this is this notion of regenerating. Okay, so that's it for the first sim bit that we're going to look at in this video. The second one we're going to look at is combine multiple entity types on a pallet. So again, I'm going to go to support, go to sample sim bit solutions, and I will just start typing combine. Oops, I forgot the M. Combine multiple Okay, and as you see, as I start typing, it narrows down the list, and so you generally don't have to type the entire name. I'm going to just use the shift method so that I open the symbit in this instance of Simio, and I don't need to save the model because I was previously looking at a symbit. So here is our symbit. Let me zoom out just a little bit so we can see it. And you can see in this case I have a combiner. I want quantities to be batched based on the type. And let's run the symbit to see what this looks like. So we can see that we have the different types of member entities, A, B, C, D, and when the batching occurs, that we batch different quantities specified here. So each batch consists of one red entity, or A, type A, 3 yellow or type B entities, 2 green or type C entities, and finally one blue or D entity. And so that batching is taking different member entity types and specifying quantities based on that type. So if we look at the combiner, extend this just a little bit so that we can see, you can see that compared to the combiner in the previous, this was a little bit more involved. The batching operation is a little bit more involved. And so we're using a different rule for the batching rule the matching rule, I'm sorry, rather than having an in the entity. We're going to specify that we have to match members and parent. So to match members and parents, we need two different matching expressions. We need a member match expression and we need a parent match expression. And so for the member match expression, we're going to use the model entity dot entity type. And so for A, that's going to obviously be A, and for B, it will be B, and C will be C, and D will be D, specified by the respective entity type. For the parent match expression, we just are going to specify those manually. So I want to specify a match expression for A, and then I have a repeat group for additional batch quantities. And so if I open that, look at my repeat group, let me shrink this down a little bit, you can see that we have one different we have a different batch quantity for each of our member entity types. So we have the A has a value of 1, and then B has a match value of 3, and C has a match value of 2, and D has a match value of 1. And so in this case, we are using the member entity type, and then we are manually specifying the match requirement for the associated parent. And so by implementing that, we can see that we are creating the specified batch sizes on each one of the palettes. So you can see that. Let me just sort of zoom in here. And here in this one, we can also see that we have the batch queue animated so that we can actually see the different entities on the different member entities on the parent entity. So that concludes this video on the combiner, or the batching process. As I mentioned earlier, there are several other options that we haven't explored having to do with the combiner. There are 2 additional symbits that go over some of those, and so I would highly recommend that you have a look at the combiner and do some experimentation on your own to make sure you understand how the batching process works, because it's a very important feature and a very useful feature in many modeling scenarios.